Welcome to another exciting episode of the Business of Digital podcast, featuring your hosts, Matt Siltala and Dave Rohr. Hey guys, we're excited to have you on another one of these Business of Digital podcasts. Today, my good friend Susan Wenograd. Hey Susan, how you doing?
Hello, how are you guys?
We're great, but she is joining us to talk about bidding or not bidding on brand terms. But before we jump into that, Susan is the CMO of AimClear. I feel like I'm surrounded with just amazing buddies right now because I think of AimClear and I think of my good friend and photography buddy Marty, of course, and Laura, his wonderful wife, and then you running the show there now. And anyway, so I don't know if there's anything I left out, Susan, but I'm just grateful to have you on the show and chatting about this. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. You know, I love geeking out about this stuff, so it's my pleasure.
Yes, we're the only ones that can geek about bidding on or not bidding on brand.
Correct. Like, what other podcast am I going to go on where this is a thing? It makes me so happy.
All right. Well,
this
Dave,
is what happens when you tweet,
it.
Susan.
Yeah, I know. I did it to myself, right?
Yes, you did.
So for those that listen, or for those new people that just found us from PubCon, welcome. But the other day, Susan decided to tweet out, and it's like one of the few times during the day when I happen to be jumping on Twitter. She tweeted out that she was going to write a blog post about, oh my God, bidding on brands. And for those that listen, episode 116, we talked about it a little bit, about whether you should or should not. And I think the answer we came up with is it depends. It's not only an SEO answer, it can be a PPC answer.
Well, we discovered, right?
Everything depends, especially when it comes to marketing. Is this the right thing? It depends on the ROI. It depends on a lot of things. Depends. So I think, Susan, we've already heard me ramble about this before. Why don't you give us your quick hot take,
Sure.
And then we will jump into the tactical of how to do it properly, because we already started talking about it and I basically shut up because we could talk about this for 20 minutes. So I will let you give your take on whether you should or should not, and then we'll just jump into how to properly do it.
Okay. So my hot take on this is, more often than not, you probably should be. I see people get very emotional about this, and there's really two camps. There's one camp that's like, we shouldn't have to defend our brand name. So just on principle, they don't want to do it, which I'm a marketer, so I'm a data person. I don't really look at it as a moral thing as to whether or not you should have to defend your brand name. I just kind of see that as part of being in marketing and part of having a brand and running a business and brand awareness and all of that good stuff. So, you can have a moral debate about it all you want, but marketing's been around forever and there's been versions of this in the past. And that's just part of having a business and a brand that you defend. The other camp is the one that says it's a waste of money because it's going to come in through organic anyway. And I think that is the area where it's an it depends thing to an extent. But I think there's shades of gray. So in regards to what forms of the brand you should be bidding on, I think a lot of people address it and approach it as a zero-sum game where it's like you have to bid on all or nothing, which is definitely not the case. So there's some shades of gray in there I think we can go into. And then the other piece of that as well is, if you're a brand that's not known and you're driving top of funnel brand awareness, do you really want to take the gamble of not protecting your name? And an example I have from this is, we manage a service provider. I don't want to go into the vertical or anything, but they spend about $350,000 a month. And in the state where they operate, they are very, very well known. So we could easily spend probably 150 to 200K a month just on their brand name. And so it's been a point of ongoing contention, understandably, because they're going, do we really have to spend this money to, defend our name? And so for a month, they said, let's just cut the spend in half and see if organic picks it up. So in August, we slashed what we spend on brand from 160K a month to 80K a month. And it was definitely felt from an impact perspective. The conversions dropped dramatically. We did not see, and they're a local business too with multiple locations, like we didn't see that volume get picked up by organic or map packs. So it settled it for them that this is just part of the landscape. And I think they feel okay with it now that they've seen, what happens. So it's not to say that that's going to happen with every brand, But I think that the distinction is also like, why are people searching for a brand? If someone searches for a product and they use Amazon in the bidding, there's probably reasons they specifically want Amazon that you're not going to compete with. You don't offer Prime, you don't have next day shipping or same day shipping. So there's also those pieces where, if someone wants to search on Amazon, they're probably going to go ahead and buy on Amazon versus someone that's investigating a name that they've heard of, or they're comparing providers. It's a user intent question as well. So I think that there's a couple of these factors that go into making these decisions about brand versus non-brand. But just from a marketing perspective, if you're going to spend a lot of money trying to get people to know your brand and then refuse to defend your own brand name, it seems kind of silly to me to spend all that money on top of funnel awareness and then just say, well, I'm not going to spend the few bucks it's going to take for someone to click on my link. And sometimes it's a few cents. I mean, sometimes it's even less than that. But it just seems so short-sighted to spend all that time. It takes so much time to build that brand awareness momentum to just push that wave as much as you can and then just have it not crest and finish it off. Just seems like just silly to me, I guess. It usually in the grand scheme of things, it's not going to be the majority of where you spend your money. So as a marketer, I look at it and go, why would you not? Unless, if the monetarily it proves that it doesn't matter, that's a different story. But to just refuse to do it out of the gate, on a moralistic principle, or to assume that it's going to be picked up by something else, I think is a little bit of a fool's errand at this point, especially with how Google is changing things so that there's less clicks going to the site. They're trying to proactively provide the information. You just can't assume that organic's going to pick all that stuff up anymore.
So you mean you tested it?
Yeah. Crazy talk, I know.
Crazy talk, yeah. Yeah, we tested it for one of my clients recently, and we did not see anything. There wasn't really much. But there also was so in this scheme, we'll just say it's around a $10,000 a month budget.
Mm-hmm.
Very little was going to brand.
Yeah.
And we saw very little movement otherwise, organic or otherwise. I mean, it was maybe $100 or $500, $100 or $200 at the very most.
Yeah.
And it wasn't really moving it, and it's a SaaS solution. But yeah, I think you really have to test it. And I think there also is, which is, I'll allude to what we talked about earlier, is what you bid on. Mm-hmm. So how do you make sure that those job seekers or someone looking for an address, if you're an online only, someone looking for your address is probably looking to either deliver something or for a job. Mm-hmm. What on across the board almost do you always assume is going to be a non-buyer?
We usually get rid of kind of the example you just gave, things like where it's jobs, careers. This brand in the state that I mentioned, it's headed by a very well-known person. So people search for that person's name, and then things like net worth or, things that are just they're not potential customers. They're, journalists, they're PR people, they're vendors. It just becomes very evident in the search queries. I think the one where the testing ends up being the most important. And this was something that we have turned off and on for this brand several times specifically to test, is if someone just types in an exact match, what does that mean? Because we don't have any additional information about the intent of what they're doing. So it makes it challenging because there could be a considerable amount of those searches occurring, and following them all the way through to see, are these people that already know what they want, and kind of the classic, they're just typing it into the search bar, not realizing that they're not going directly to the site. They're just typing it in and then clicking on the link, versus people that may be looking for something else. So in that example, the one that we've tested a lot is that exact match of the person's name, because it does bring a lot of conversions, but there's just been the question of at what cost, like how much waste is there generated just to get those 2 to 3 conversions. So there's always those broader keywords that don't have the intent. And those are the ones that I find require the testing, because some places might search for a brand name because they heard of it and they don't know what it is. Sometimes they're searching, like I said, because they're just trying to get to their website, and you may never be able to figure out that intent, but you can certainly tie it back to ROI and what it's costing you to catch those users who are searching for it. So that's usually the one that I find we have to test most. But you can usually tell in the search queries, what the intent is like, kind of the examples I mentioned. And we usually with brands wind up having a mix of broad match, but then also a really long negative keyword list. So we find a lot of times for our brand campaigns that our negative keyword list is a lot longer than most of our other campaigns, just for that reason. Because over time, we've gotten enough data to figure out if these queries are relevant or not. And there may be some that look like they'd be super important to the business. And then you find, if you have a year or two of data, you're like, wow, we spent a lot of money on this and I don't really know that these users have done anything. So sometimes we'll look at things like their activities on the site as well to figure out, like, if they're just landing and bouncing, are they actually valuable from an engagement standpoint where they're reading a lot of content or signing up for newsletters or things that might not be, considered a bottom of funnel conversion? Are they doing other things that are still valuable to the business?
One of the things that you mentioned there that I thought was important, and this is what I see. And again, I know that we're talking about bidding on brand terms and stuff, but just the fact that you're talking about how you're using years, months, if not years, to collect data, and how so many times people come in and they're like, after 30 days or something, they're like, this isn't working and I want to turn it off. And I just think it's important to point out the fact that the more data that you have and what you're talking about, the better that this is. And so that's just something that people need to think about as well with all this.
Yeah, and I think tied to that, the efforts that you do over that time make a big difference too. So one of the things that we've done at AimClear that we're doing very heavily at this point because we believe in it is we're really having to get back to old school marketing tactics because the platforms are so crowded, they've become so competitive, advertising has become so expensive, and that direct response return, we've seen it diluted, not because the ads don't work, but because it takes them longer to. So one of the things we've experimented with a lot is what happens if we just go for super high reach and frequency, the cheapest, campaign objectives we can that still reach the targets we want, and looking at things like what happens to brand search when we do that. So there's also those things you have to consider is that, the marketing that you do on the front end doesn't live the same way forever, generally speaking. So you're probably going to see fluctuations in those brand searches based on how you're influencing the top of the funnel. So that's another area where you really do yourself a disservice if you go out and you have like this great PR hit and you don't bid on your own name and your competitors do, you look like you're missing the boat. So you also kind of have to be careful about it from that perspective too. There's just that ripple effect of how often those searches happen and what's happening externally that drives that.
I'm just laughing because as you're telling me this, I just think about messages that I get from you on occasion. This is why I love this platform and why I hate it.
I have continual frustrations with Facebook. They are well documented in the cybersphere. But and that's one of those things too that like there are things that you do on those platforms that, based on by their numbers, it looks like you're not doing anything. But that's why understanding what happens in other channels becomes so important. If you're going to spend that kind of money, looking at things like what does your direct traffic do over time? Are your brand searches growing over time? All of those are things that should be influencing your decision on whether or not to bid on your brand. I think to Dave's example, if it's a smaller client and it's not really moving the needle, it might not matter. But if they decide to invest, $20,000 one month in YouTube or something that is specifically trying to drive brand awareness, for sure, you're probably going to want to revisit the fact that you're not bidding on your own brand name. Because you're going to have this influx of traffic that you're not used to having. I think the other piece too tied to that no one really talks about is based on what people are searching for your brand. The nice part is bidding on your brand name and PPC, you have options for where to drive them. So you don't just have to drive them to your homepage. So as you start to learn those queries that users are looking for, if you're just bidding on your brand name and just driving everybody to the homepage and you're not separating out the intent of those users, you're really missing the boat because you're just going to assume that organic's going to figure out what they're looking for. And if it's not, a high intent audience, or if it is a high intent audience that just doesn't have a ton of data, the organic side might struggle to know where to send them, and or you might be able to provide a better experience based on that query versus, creating a part of your site just for that to get crawled by organic. You have a way to control that user experience with how they interact with your brand.
Which leads me to a question. Last time we talked about it, and you also mentioned it, like if you're a startup or if you have a new product launch, you're maybe not always going to have, if someone does a search for your, Nike, we'll say Nike has new shoes, which they have new shoes, every other week. maybe you were doing a huge push for Jordans, and you want to get in front when Mr. Matt over there does a search for Jordans or Nike.
He does love his sneakers.
He loves his Nike. He's a bit of a sneakerhead. So you have a new product or you have a new launch or your new company. Instead of them landing on the homepage and going, what the heck is this? Where is this product? You could use your brand search and your ads to get in front of everything.
Exactly. And especially if it's something that might be a little more obscure and short term, where, if you have a sweepstakes or if you have a giveaway or an offer or something that like is only, if it's like a 3-day promotion, and if you're not crawled frequently enough to really get indexed well for it because it's going to take longer, those quick hits are another way to utilize that. Because if people, hear a commercial about it or see an ad about it and they want to figure out more about it later, being prepared for what those queries are going to look like and where you want to drive them to is also usually a pretty big missed opportunity for many brands.
Or upcoming would be Cyber Monday.
Yep.
You could get them on your email list and build towards that.
Exactly.
Someone looking for it.
Yeah, but that would require thinking ahead on your marketing.
Yes, it would.
And I think the other part that's hard is because none of these platforms are connected, there's just also still, and this is a problem, whether it's brand or Facebook or any platform you run on, even though people know that the attribution in those isn't correct, since there's nothing to replace it, people still kind of fall back on it. So I think that's the other danger that people run into is they look at it and say, well, I shouldn't have to bid on my brand, or it hasn't really done anything. And they're not connecting the dots between things like you just mentioned, like things that are going to be upcoming, and sort of having a crystal ball to predict what users are going to be doing based on seasonality, based on the news, based on things that you've done top of funnel. There's definitely still that disconnect there where people are not thinking all the way through the user experience. So that's something else that I see very often when it comes to brand versus, bidding and not bidding.
Well, you'd have to talk to other teams. You have to talk to your product team, your PR team. And actually, another question, have you ever used, so I don't run into any of my clients that are well known enough that they're looking for net worth. But that just made me think of, have you ever worked in ad, assuming that someone is looking for net worth, they might just be a blogger or someone. Have you ever tried to use like a PR angle for the ad and the landing page to say, hey, are you looking for so-and-so? Do you want to interview them or do you want to talk to them?
I have not, but I would be willing to bet that AimClear probably has before I got there, just because we're pretty strong on the PR front. If
someone was to ask for about Marty, someone was looking up Marty's name, it's like, oh, do you want him to speak at the conference? Here's his one sheeter, here's him. Do you want to talk to him and get 5 minutes of his time?
I'm pretty sure that probably Marty has done something like that in the past, at least for other clients, because we're pretty big on integrating PR as much as we can with all of our paid efforts. So I haven't personally done it, but I would be willing to bet that at some point they have done that or tested it for a client.
Just wonder, I can't think of any examples that I've used it, but I think it would make sense.
It's a good idea, though.
Sometimes
I might steal that.
Do you have another question, Matt? Otherwise, I got one.
Oh, no, go ahead.
So going a little tactical do you keep lists for brand that you then use as negatives when you're doing brand, or how do you kind of try to keep brand and non-brand separated? So say I'm looking at my computer right now. If someone's looking for a Dell laptop computer, bit redundant, but we'll just go with it.
That's how people search, though.
I know. Too much keyword research. Or versus laptop computer. If you only want Dell, are you creating just, different keyword lists or negative terms that you then apply to everything? Or how do you kind of make sure that if you're bidding on brand versus not bidding, to kind of separate it a little bit?
Usually what I personally do, and I mean, I would be willing to bet this is pretty much a best practice for everybody to AimClear at this point, but we'll take the brand name and add it as a negative to the non-brand stuff to make sure that it filters properly. It's kind of amazing how many accounts you take over where they'll have a brand set up, but they don't apply the brand name as a negative to their non-brand stuff. And when you look in the search queries, you see their brand name showing up everywhere. So it's always kind of sad when you audit an account and see that, because you're like, okay, so your non-brand results are not as good as you think because, they're heavily skewed by the fact that these actually are queries. There's still sometimes that, forgetfulness between queries versus, what you're matched to from a keyword perspective.
Yep.
So we'll usually take the brand name and just add it as like a global negative to anything that's non-brand to start with. And that usually makes sure that we filter everything towards the brand side. And then on the brand side, if we do broad match of any kind, it's always modified. So it's just a requirement that the brand name has to be in there on anything that runs on that side, no matter how we decide to break out the permutations of it and the ad sets and all that kind of stuff. We make sure that the brand name is a required piece of that query.
And if people don't understand why you'd want to do that, I've seen $30 to $40 clicks for something that included the brand, but because it was also had a variation of a term that we were it was aggressively going for, Google would show that one instead of the brand one.
Yep.
And lo and behold, instead of paying 25 cents for that click, they spent, $45.
Yeah. I mean, it makes a big difference what they decide to match it to. And I think that's something that it's going to become even more prevalent with the non-exact match that we have now. Because
they really need to change the name of that, because it's not even an exact match. It's just, it's really close.
We were talking like exact-ish match.
Yeah.
But I think that that's going to be a problem that becomes even more prevalent, because it's going to keep trying to infer, to your point, if someone searches for a laptop, the odds that it's going to try and insert a brand name in there based on your past history and stuff, it looks like that those odds are going to increase over time as they try and make it smarter. So it becomes all the more important just to have a lot more control over things versus how you used to, because we're losing control. So paying attention to this stuff even more is becoming, I think, a lot more important.
Just trust the AI. It knows everything.
Not
Eventually it
based on the
will,
data
but
I've
not
seen.
today.
Yeah, not today.
Not today. So for someone that is trying to decide to bid or not to bid, what would be the one or two things you would kind of break down and say, really think through these two things, or at least look at these things?
I would say to go ahead and do it. I mean, you unfortunately have to test it on a sequential basis. So it's something where you're probably going to have to turn it on for a few weeks, watch what it does, and then turn it off and see if it changes. That's the most simplistic way to do it. It's not, the sexiest way, but it's the easiest way for people to do it. But I think people really the other thing is they need to get in the habit of, if you are going to start spending more money top of funnel, where you're like, we've kind of maxed out paid search, or there are terms, they're non-brand or so expensive that it's just, that doesn't make sense for us from an ROI standpoint to bid there. If you're going to start going for relatively cheaper media on something like a Facebook or a Snapchat or Instagram or any of those paid social platforms, you'll get some direct response from those, but the biggest bulk of what you're going to get for it is brand awareness and building remarketing. So if you're going to start spending money there, you need to revisit what it's like as a user to search for your name. Because if you've got, let's just say two competitors show up for your name, one of the examples that we had given the large brand I was discussing before is we did a screencast where we actually said, look, this is what it looks like now. And here you are at the top. And if that's removed, that will be replaced by another competitor who's getting site links and all this stuff that's pushing your organic basically off the first half of the front page at this point, because the map pack and everything was below it. And then it was even worse when you did it on mobile. They wouldn't appear at all, basically. Someone would have to scroll all the way. So that's the other piece too, is you need to think through it from a UX perspective, where if it's a user that's looking for you and they search your name and you're not there above the top of the fold, there is also, it's difficult because we've been trained to believe that everything is measurable and digital. It's not. There is something psychological about someone that searches for your brand and they don't see you.
You lose a lot of trust, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't make you look like you know what's going on. It makes you look small. It makes you look unprepared. So there's just also the, how much do you want to pay to make sure that you're putting the best foot forward? And I think it's kind of funny that we came from an advertising history of, there was targeting and that we knew who was buying magazines and such, but we couldn't measure that and people were okay with that. The pendulum has swung so far in the other direction that people just obsessively look at exactly what they think came from each thing. And I think, the truth of the matter is it all works together, which is not to say, in every case, you should be spending $250K a month on your brand, but there's probably a certain amount you should be spending. How much is the perfect amount is probably just going to always vary and it's going to require testing. But I just think it's really foolish of people that, they get mad at Google about it, or, they're like, I'm not going to spend money on that. It's like, you're spending so much more money to build awareness to begin with. It's just a really silly thing to decide to cheap out on.
to worry about that 2%
Yep.
or 1%.
Absolutely.
And if you don't think people are multiple touch, go into your Google Analytics and look at your your touch points and your conversion flow.
Yeah.
It's amazing, like how
Yeah.
many times it'll be direct, PPC, organic, email, and it's like, what?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah,
3% of the people that converted last month, that was their flow. It's like, that
Yeah.
makes no sense.
Yeah, we actually, in one of my slide decks, I have an example of that for like a SaaS product, and there's 13 touch points
Yeah.
before they converted, which, it's a longer term sale, and I get that, but
Like
it's
wedding,
just amazing.
wedding planning, for example. I saw that. We've
Yeah,
seen that,
anything long term like that, like a lot of like trip planning and hotel bookings and that kind of stuff. People tend to shop around for that, so they go a bunch of different places. So that's the other piece too, is like, you don't know what other places they've been to. You don't know who else they're comparing you to. There's all those factors. There's a whole kind of black box of consumer psychology that people just don't acknowledge or kind of forget about because we're so obsessed with the numbers themselves. That I think it's kind of made us worse marketers in some cases. And I think that, the brand and the debate about, the all or nothingness that I've seen people stick their flag in the ground, and it just seems very short-sighted.
Yeah, I did lead gen once, and we were selling to doctors, and the buying cycle was 18 to 24 months.
Yep.
We had no insight into anything because,
We think it worked. We don't know.
We'll know in a year and a half.
Yeah,
if
exactly.
what those leads were worth.
And by
So,
then, that targeting might not be available anymore anyway. So
yeah, especially these days.
yeah.
So,
Same deal.
is there anything else, Matt?
Just made me think of a personal injury lawyer that we're working with as well. Same kind of timeline, but.
Yeah, it's a long timeline for stuff like that. You just don't know.
Well, looky there. We managed to talk about 26 minutes on bidding
Again.
or not bidding on your brand terms. Good for us. Well, thank you to everybody that joined us, and a big thank you to Susan. Thank you so much for geeking out with us and helping hopefully clear this up for a lot of people and giving them a way to understand this better. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I love the subject.
All right. Well, for Susan with AimClear and Dave with Northside Metrics, I'm Matt Soltala with Avalanche Media, and we will be excited to have you guys back on another one of these. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks all.